The Finance Minister Tito Mboweni has been urged to find the balancing act in his budget speech on Wednesday and to stick to a fiscal consolidation. The National Treasury has confirmed that the 2021 National Budget speech will be delivered on Wednesday. Right, and to discuss this further, we're now joined by economist and researcher at the Institute for Economic Justice, Busi Sibeko. Busi, a very warm welcome to you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for being with us here on SABC News.
Thank you for having me.
All right, let's start off with the conversation around SOEs. I think there's been a lot of talk around SOEs. I mean, just one look at social media, for example, there's too much talk on SOEs. How should the finance minister be addressing them, particularly if we're looking at, for example, Eskom and SAA? There's been a lot of trouble, a lot of problems with SAA particularly. Where do you think the minister should really kind of be looking and starting?
Yeah, I think our government has to ask and answer the fundamental question, which is what goods should be provided by the government and what goods should be provided by the private sector. And so if we believe, and if we believe a developmental state, I believe a developmental state should be able to provision electricity, for instance, then we must then put our focus on how to resolve the Eskom issue. And privatization is not the solution, right? Because if we agree that energy should be a public good, then we should believe that our government should make the appropriate plans to resolve the debt, one, but also two, the management issues that have risen, but also three, move towards a just transition. How do we move away from coal-fired electricity towards climate just energy? And so those are sort of the issues that we should be looking at. And in terms of SAA, there's a lot of debate that can be had around, what use does SAA have for the state? And I think these are questions that we must deeply answer without simply resulting to just privatizing, because it seems like the easiest way out. Yeah. In fact, we must answer the difficult questions so that we can give the appropriate solutions for these state-owned entities. And this extends to all the state-owned entities. I think there's a tendency to focus on Eskom and SAA, but I believe strongly that we need to look at all the other state-owned entities to ensure that we do not go in the same paths where they get to crisis level and therefore we are discussing them because they're currently in a crisis state.
Yeah, and then when we talk about crisis, we can't leave out the issue of unemployment, and I'm sure you saw those numbers that were released and those percentages that were released by Stats SA today, now reaching 32.5% in the last quarter of 2020 in terms of unemployment. How is this budget supposed to? This budget supposed to address that problem, which is it's such an extent that one actually looks at it and thinks, wow, those numbers are just so high that one wonders how to even address such an issue. I mean, so many people unemployed in our country, and then we still have these crises which will lead to, in fact, further unemployment. If we're looking at SOEs, for example.
Absolutely, and I think the budget is a very critical policy when thinking about unemployment. And there's three ways I think this budget needs to resolve the issue of falling incomes particularly. The first one is that we need to work towards a universal basic income grant in South Africa, which would include the unemployed, people between 18 and 59 ideally as an initial rollout, and would include caregivers who have been excluded from the current SRD grant that has been rolled out. That's the first thing. We need to boost households so that they can also participate in the market. So we need to boost demand. And then the second thing that this budget needs to look at, and this needs to be explored further, is how can government consider jobs guarantee programs? And so how do we expand the expanded public works program is something that we need to look at deeply. And the third one, and a myth that must be debunked, is this notion that the national budget is like a household budget, because our expenditure is a 30% of GDP. So when you shrink the budget, which is what's happening over the next couple of years, you actually shrink the economy itself. And so as a result, you also, private sector is already shrinking because of the current crisis. And so when you shrink government expenditure, you actually depress the economy even further. So more jobs are likely to be lost during this period in time. And so what is critical is that our government needs to institute and implement emergency rescue measures. We found that only about a third of the 500 billion had been utilized about 2 weeks ago when we analyzed that emergency rescue package. And so as you can imagine, the failure to fully utilize that 500 billion in itself will have ramifications for how we are able to keep businesses afloat and households as well. And so these are some of the things that we need to be thinking about when thinking about unemployment in our context and how to ensure that people still have incomes during this crisis and can make their way out.
Yeah, Busi, as we're talking here, one can feel perhaps disheartened, but I'm just wondering, as some people are unemployed, some are, starting to look at entrepreneurship as a way of making a living. And I wonder if, the government, the finance minister is, looking at that too. Are there ways to assist entrepreneurs, those people who are being forced to, look at other ways of making an income, and how best would, that be addressed, the fact that we are having a lot of emerging sort of entrepreneurs?
Yeah, and I think that's a very challenging question, because how our government is actually oriented is around how do we create structural reforms that enable business. But what we would argue at the Institute is that what we need fundamentally is structural transformation, which requires a slightly different set of tools which would enable entrepreneurship in a different way. So I think what I'm trying to say here is to say that we are trying to do what we've always done better, but that hasn't yielded the results that we want. And doing more of that will not necessarily help entrepreneurs to build and grow the way that they need to. And of course, there's been a huge focus on SMEs and a lot of growth agendas. But it is critical that we do not utilize neoliberal solutions to SMEs, because what we're finding, what I've argued, at least in my master's thesis, is this idea that we give entrepreneurs the inappropriate support. In fact, we need to rethink the support that entrepreneurs need so that we can get structural transformation in our economy as a whole.
All right. Busi Sibeko, great pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so very much for giving us your input as we look forward to that address by the Minister of Finance. Much appreciated, ma'am. All right. Let's take a short break. More news after this.